Hello, this is the second presenting group for the Chiquita and Colombia case. We will discuss the root causes for Chiquita's actions and whether they could have done anything different. Then we will define the problem statement and discuss what the new CEO can do to restore Chiquita's reputation. Finally, we will discuss the investigation into Chiquita's misdeeds and how the length of the investigation and the musical chairs of the key players at Chiquita and the Justice Department affected it.
Okay, so our question is, what were the root causes for Chiquita's actions in Colombia that ultimately led to their conviction? And I'd just like to start by distinguishing root cause, which to me means a systemic failure where an intervention could have reasonably been implemented to prevent an undesirable outcome. And that's usually a single failure that occurs or can be traced back to a single issue that a company has, whereas a contributing factor to me is more something that is partially responsible, but in and of itself wouldn't necessarily have caused the outcome. And I think when we get into it and I describe it, it'll be more clear that there are a lot of contributing factors, but ultimately one root cause. So the major contributing factors were first was Chiquita's level of vertical integration. Obviously, it had not been involved in the upstream side of the supply chain for bananas. They wouldn't have been exposed to extortion at all. The next would be the history of instability in Colombia. Obviously we're going to talk about it, but it's a volatile country, and that volatility kind of manifests itself in the formation of these paramilitary groups, which ultimately are who extort Chiquita. So that's obviously contributing there. Chiquita's and its predecessors' imperialistic behavior in the region, I think, is a contributor in that they sort of contribute to the instability by their actions, which we'll get into, and then the designation of the AUC as a terrorist organization. Had they not been labeled that, it technically wouldn't have been committing a crime. Now they still would have been making some poor ethical decisions, but that wouldn't technically have been a crime had they not been designated terrorists. Okay, so vertical integration. So Chiquita was obviously heavily involved in the supply chain of bananas, and that exposed the company to the extortion. And then, in this particular instance, Chiquita had gotten out of direct control of their holdings in Colombia, and instead was working through subsidiaries. And while this insulated them from the costs of running the business in what is otherwise a volatile nation, it also insulated them from the responsibility of day-to-day decision making. So by having these layers of bureaucracy in place, it was easier for them to pass the buck and not take ownership of their unethical decisions. This was especially true when it came to changing decisions that were already being made. Originally, the AUC was not classified as a terrorist group, and therefore, when the decision was made to pay them off, it may have been seen as slightly unethical but not illegal. Since Chiquita executives did not oversee the day-to-day operations, it was easier for them to ignore the AUC's classification change and the ramifications it had on the previously made decisions to pay them off. Okay, the next contributing factor is the history of instability in Colombia. The Colombian armed conflict and Colombian Civil War began in the mid-1960s. And it can be traced back to the 1948 assassination of the popularist political leader Jorge Gaitán. It was at that time, in the 1960s, that the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, formed along with some other paramilitary groups, and they began their guerrilla insurgency campaign against the government. The FARC fashioned themselves as Leninists, Marxists, revolutionary, agrarian, anti-imperialist, anti-neo-imperialism. They claimed to represent the rural poor against the wealthy Colombian wealthy class, and against the U.S. influence and monopolization of natural resources by multinationals such as Chiquita. Now the conflict kind of increased after the fall of the Soviet Union and the spread of the illegal drug trade, the U.S. war against drugs, and then the formation of drug cartels. And eventually the AUC, which is the group that ended up actually extorting Chiquita, although the FARC also extorted Chiquita, but the AUC is the organization that was labeled a terrorist organization and was actually the organization that Chiquita was paying bribes to. So they formed kind of in opposition. They're an extreme right-wing group, kind of to counter the FARC's left wing. So Chiquita and its predecessors, the United Fruit Company's monopolistic tendencies were contributing factors, sort of by contributing to the previous discussed factor, which was the instability in the region. It's sort of ironic that its actions and its obsession with dominance was at least in part responsible for the rise in these militant groups and guerrillas, which ultimately led to its conviction. So their imperialistic tendencies kind of included like dominating regional distribution and transportation networks. They kept otherwise farmable land from the local growers. They conspired with the local governments to keep control and set up banana republics in the region. In some instances, the company allowed vast tracts of land under its ownership to remain uncultivated under the guise of needing to protect itself against natural disaster and whatnot. And it discouraged the government from building highways and other infrastructures, which would have lessened the profitable transportation monopolies of the railroad under its control. Okay, now we come to the root cause. I think that it's pretty obvious why the other factors contribute, but to me this is the reason that the company was really convicted. The other factors, a lot of companies operate in unstable regions. A lot of companies own their supply chains. A lot of companies have had imperialistic tendencies in the past, but that doesn't cause those companies to be convicted of this crime. What I think really damns a company is that they didn't have a clear standard for ethical conduct, and I think it's pretty clear that that's the cause because they've just made some textbook bad ethical decisions. To start with, the council says that this is a strictly ethical question because it's not a crime to pay these organizations. Well, at the time, the AUC wasn't a terrorist organization, so yes, it was just an ethical decision. But just because it's not illegal doesn't mean it's the right decision to make. And at one point, their defense, they say that all the government had to do was just say this, just to say stop making these payments, but they never did, and they just seem to want to pass the buck and not accept any responsibility for their decision. They want to say, hey, it wasn't illegal, therefore it should be okay, and that's just patent bad ethical decision making. And then the next one was their counsel also said at one point that in the article that what kept me going was the knowledge that I hadn't done anything wrong. Well, again, patent bad bad logical or bad ethical decision making there. Just because you think that it's not wrong doesn't mean it's not wrong. And then the company kind of claimed to be a victim, and it didn't say so in the article, but you can sort of see how they came to that decision to continue to pay these bribes. That, if they had just left the company or left the country, somebody else would have paid these bribes. So I just think that the real root cause is that they just didn't bother to really think through the impact or the consequences they had. Had they used something like the publicity test, it would have been more clear to them, I think, that this was a bad decision, but they just didn't have a policy or an ethics officer or any kind of tool or process to go through to help them make a sound decision, and they paid the price for it.
The best solution would have been for Chiquita to stop payments to the AUC. Their Colombian subsidiary, Banadex, had a long history of making protection payments to terrorist groups. Robert Olson formally had the payments to the AUC investigated in 2000, where it was determined the payments were ethically questionable, though not illegal. The committee said the payments were extortion, however, payments continued. Chiquita justified the payments, stating it was the only way they could protect their land and employees from violence. The AUC was added to the list of terrorist organizations in 2000, making it illegal for a U.S. company to provide payments. However, Chiquita continued making payments until 2004, even after multiple interactions with the Justice Department had advised them to stop. Chiquita's actions over the course of the payments created a documented trail of their knowledge of wrongdoing, where they had opportunities to take corrective action, however, continued unethical and illegal activity. Chiquita was aware of the issues in Colombia. When it was United Fruit Company, there were many instances of unethical interactions, including government influences to control transportation networks within the country, and a massacre that killed thousands of UFC employees when they were protesting poor working conditions. Chiquita's CEO felt it was impossible to protect employees in Colombia, and the government was unable to police the lands. Therefore, payments to the AUC were necessary to conduct business in Colombia. Knowing there was great political and economic instability in Colombia, and payments to terrorist organizations were almost required to conduct business, Chiquita should have sold Banadex very early on. Colombia was ranked 13th overall in banana production, so they could have entered other countries with less risk to replace their Colombian banana production. Eventually, Chiquita did sell Banadex to a local Colombian company and contracted to buy bananas from the same farms. While they were still linked to the corruption that exists in Colombia through this relationship, an earlier execution of this deal would have prevented them from being directly tied to the illegal payments. Senior management was aware of the payments from the beginning. The CEO, director, and head of the audit committee, and the VP and general legal counsel had ordered the payments to continue, despite recommendations from the Justice Department. However, during legal proceedings, these members were not named nor held accountable for their involvement in the illegal activity. Internal audit committees and outside legal counsel both advised Chiquita to stop payments. The lack of transparency between the different layers of the organization made individuals uncomfortable challenging senior management's unethical decision. As it was also seen in the Chiquita Secrets Revealed article, Chiquita had a record of poor business decisions, including mistreatment of workers, pollution, and the involvement in the drug trade. Early focus on establishing core values and creating a corporate structure that allowed for all members of the organization to be held accountable would have prevented the conflict that Chiquita continually experienced. When senior management is able to get away with unethical and illegal behaviors in the pursuit of the bottom line, that mentality trickles down through all layers of the organization, creating dysfunction throughout. Chiquita had no ethics policy, which allowed senior management to make decisions that clearly violated ethical guidelines and would later become illegal. The lack of direction made it easy for corruption to dictate Chiquita's actions. They lost control of their organization because they did not have clear boundaries in place for these types of situations. A formal ethics policy would have given senior management the opportunity to analyze their situation early on and implement corrective action. This would have removed the gray areas that management later hid behind during the legal proceedings. It is not enough to establish an ethics policy. An organization must train all employees to recognize and report unethical behaviors. Employees must not be chastised for reporting, and all reports must be fully investigated, recorded, and those in violation held accountable. Overall, there were many opportunities for Chiquita to correct their unethical behaviors, but senior management's desire to build profit from the Colombian market guided the company's actions instead.
Chiquita has 4 primary core values, broken down by category. The first being integrity. We live by our core values. We communicate an open, honest, and straightforward manner. We conduct business ethically and lawfully. The second is respect. We treat people fairly and respectfully. We recognize the importance of family in the lives of our employees. We value and benefit from individual and cultural differences. We foster individual expression, open dialogue, and a sense of belonging. The third core value is opportunity. We believe in a continuous growth and development of our employees is key to our success. We encourage teamwork, and we recognize employees for their contributions to the company's success. And responsibility, our fourth primary core value. We take pride in our work, in our products, and in satisfying our customers. We act responsibly in the communities and environments in which we live and work. We are accountable for the careful use of all resources entrusted to us, and for providing appropriate returns to our shareholders. We move to our problem statement. How do we as a company repair our image from past behavior and move forward ensuring future competitiveness and ethical compliance? So how do we produce or attain necessary quantity and quality of bananas in order to meet our consumer demand, all while balancing a terrorist-filled hostile environment? So let's look at the facts. Employee safety is a huge concern for the company. 50 employees to date have been murdered, spurring payments to the AUC. How we manage the Colombian catastrophe will directly impact employee morale and public relations. With the rise of the internet, the public is becoming more aware and concerned about the ethical sourcing of their food, so it's important that the company control the message and get out in front of the media. Some environmental limitations are that bananas can only be grown in tropical climates, and it's often cost-effective to grow in the third world where labor and land prices are low. Possible solutions. We could continue to grow in Colombia and either assume the risk to employees and their safety or continue paying the AUC. Discontinue operations in Colombia. We could seek sourcing elsewhere, but risk disrupting our ability to satisfy customer demand. We could implement an ethical standards policy within the company and encourage the culture by highlighting and rewarding people who bring up issues to the table. We would need to be transparent with the U.S. government and public and get out of the area if necessary. We could reevaluate our value chain to understand where we should focus as a provider of bananas. Do we need to focus on growing, or do we shift to distribution, allowing another company to buy our land in Colombia with maybe a contract agreement for purchasing the bananas? Our stakeholders, the U.S. government. Is U.S. commerce supporting terrorist organizations? Do we need increased regulations? 4 foreign governments in locations that they grow, such as Colombia? Do they have sustained or a loss of tax revenue? The AUC. Are they being supported? Citizens of Colombia. Do they have a loss, or are they retaining revenue through wages? The transportation industry. Do we have a supply chain coming out of Colombia? This will impact our shipping. Employees. Do they have jobs? Is there sustainability? Or do they feel good working for a company? Consumers. They're looking for low-cost, high-value product that meets their demand. And our shareholders. Is this a company you want to invest in? Is it ethical, profitable, and is it sustainable? Our key stakeholders would be our employees, our shareholders, and our consumers.
Now that we have identified our key stakeholders, let's now walk through the impact of each of the potential solutions on our key stakeholders. So, one of the potential solutions is to exit Colombia. How would this impact the employees, the consumers, and the shareholders? Let's take a look at each one. So if we exited Colombia, the impact on the employees would be that thousands of people would be unemployed, and it could potentially cause financial turmoil for the region, for our current employees, and it could bring instability to the government. As for consumers, it could potentially degrade the quality and the availability of bananas around the world, or it could potentially have the impact of increasing pricing, or it could significantly hamper the ability for us to supply the necessary product to our consumers. And finally, to our shareholders, it could severely dampen our share price, and it could potentially impact our return to shareholders. If we are unable to meet our consumers' demands, what we would see is probably a pretty significant impact on our shareholders. For the next potential impact, we have the continue to pay the AUC. How this impacts the employees? Well, it continues to provide them with protection. However, for the employees that are potentially paying the bribe, or the employees that are part of the scheme that we have going on in order to do this, it could result in illegal bribes or continued terrorist funding, which, now that it is illegal, could result in jail time or could put them at adverse risk. As for consumers, they don't really like the whole terrorist connection, things like that, so we could potentially see a boycott on our brand. It could further destroy our public image because people could link payments with terrorist actions, with murder, all those types of things. So I think it's in the best interest not to do that. As for shareholders, they could apply pressure to management to cease the payments, or they could vote against management at the AGM, so the annual general meeting of shareholders, where they could apply even more pressure, and it would be a political and public spectacle, which we do not want either. Therefore, this option probably doesn't make the most sense either. Finally, the next solution is to sell our Colombian assets. And how would this impact our employees? Well, we could potentially continue to keep our employees employed by striking an agreement as part of the purchase of our farmland and assets, so that employees at least are provided the opportunity to continue their employment. And it would also continue to have jobs in the region and would help to solidify some stability. As for consumers, it could potentially be that there's no impact to a small impact, as the quality, the amount, the availability could all continue to happen, while at the same time it could improve our PR relations, as we no longer are the ones operating within Colombia. We just have distribution agreements, or we just have an agreement for product out of the country. Finally, shareholders, they could potentially get additional capital return from the sale of the assets, which we could then use to deploy into high growth areas, or we could redeploy that capital to the shareholders in the form of share buybacks, increased dividends, or something along those lines. Finally, the last option is to operate without paying the AUC. This is probably the most dangerous of the four options, particularly for employees, as potential for murders, potential for kidnappings, ransom, all of those will increase significantly by the AUC if we do not protect our employees by either paying, exiting, or forming some sort of agreement. As for consumers, again, this is probably going to be a pretty dicey situation in terms of public relations. There could be dissatisfaction with our employees' conditions. As you know, people readily have the ability to look up on the internet how these things can impact our potential business. So I think that's one area we want to really focus, and probably doesn't make sense for us to operate without paying the AUC. As for shareholders, again, shareholders are looking out for everyone involved. So they could also be looking out for our employees, where they could additionally put pressure on management, or they could advocate for transparency. Now that we've identified the potential solutions and those impacts on our key stakeholders, let me just remind you briefly of what Chiquita's core values are. That's integrity, respect, opportunity, and responsibility. We have created a framework which allows us to prioritize our values by balancing them with kind of their counterweights. Therefore, we suggest to implement the framework that balances legal requirements with honesty, so doing what's legally required, but doing it in an honest and transparent way, balancing compassion with loyalty and fairness. So we want to be compassionate for all of our stakeholders while treating them with loyalty and treating them fairly, whether that's in labor negotiations, whether that's in return to shareholders, or whether that's in fair prices for the quality of our goods. The next one that we want to do is balance the safety and health with the environment. As part of our new initiative, we want to leave the environment better than when we found it. So we want to have safety in place for our employees, we want to ensure their health, and we want to do all of this while ensuring that what we put into the ground and how we grow our crop, or how our suppliers grow the crop, are meeting the latest standards for environmental safety. And finally, we want to balance the economic stability with our profits. Therefore, whatever is good for Colombia, we need to balance that with the profits for our organization. Therefore, we want to ensure that there's stability and continuity within the region that we operate, and we want to ensure that that stability allows us and leads to profits for our shareholders, our stakeholders, while keeping the prices down for our consumers. These are all the ways that we are going to execute our core values and bring them to fruition as part of our new framework, which prioritizes the values across all of our stakeholders. This leads us to restoring the reputation of Chiquita and increasing our competitive positions. The first step we will do is divest all of our Colombian assets. That means we will sell all of our farms in Colombia to trusted and vetted buyers. And as part of these negotiations, we will require buyers to offer positions to all affected farm employees as part of the transaction. Finally, we will stipulate an agreement to maintain product quality and availability with these purchase agreements. Therefore, it'll strike a good balance between our key stakeholders' needs for consumers, employees, and our shareholders. Second, we will implement supplier code of conduct. How will we do this? The supplier code of conduct will include things such as employee working conditions mandate, an ethical behavior clause. Therefore, we no longer allow terrorist payments, ransom policy, and we also will ensure guidelines for how to grow product with the appropriate quality and with the appropriate control procedures in place. This supplier code of conduct will be auditable, and we will follow up with our suppliers intermittently to ensure they are following the code of conduct as we have laid it out. The third step is we will redeploy the capital from the divestments of the Colombian assets to growth opportunities. So we will utilize the capital from Colombia to reinvest in opportunities that meet the changing consumers' preferences. This will allow us to strengthen our marketing and distribution channels through additional capital spend. It will allow us to enter new markets for fresh foods, fresh produce. It will allow us to make foods that are easy, accessible, and readily available. So things that are on the go for everyone's busy lives these days. And finally, if there's any capital left over, we will redeploy that excess capital to shareholders through either dividends or additional share buybacks. Finally, the fourth step, and the one that's most important for improving our public relations position, is we will implement a sustainability report and audit. So what this means is every year we will produce a transparent and easily readable sustainability report. This will show where we source our crops from. This will show how we source it, what kind of agreements we have in place, the supplier code of conduct, the audit results from said code of conduct, and a myriad of other metrics that we feel are necessary to provide true transparency to all of our stakeholders. This will be done on a periodic basis, and the audit will be done by third-party experts, and if there are any deficiencies within the audit results, we will implement a remedy and an action plan to remedy those deficiencies within 6 months. These are the steps that we feel are necessary in order to restore Chiquita's reputation and to improve our competitive position in the ever-changing food market. Finally, what were the critical factors for us to come to this four-step process? 1. Stability in Colombia, politically, socially, and safety-wise. 2. The ability to find a suitable buyer for our Colombian assets. These buyers meet our vetting requirements, and we're able to strike the necessary agreements with them. 3. Potential growth opportunities aside from the Colombia farming assets. So our ability to enter into new growth markets and to redeploy our capital in a meaningful way. And 4, the legal requirements in Colombia and the United States. If something were to change where we were no longer able to sufficiently operate in Colombia, or if we were no longer able to get product from Colombia because of a trade ban or an embargo, then that would also impact our decision. And 5th, the sustainability of the business model post-divestment and social acceptance of these changes. So what this means is we need to have a sustainable model that we can control, so the supplier distribution agreement, and we need to ensure that our new suppliers are following the code of conduct that we laid out, which we believe will help in transparency with our consumers and will lead to a better PR position for our firm. So these 5 steps we believe are critical for making the decisions to improve the reputation and competitive position of our business.
Chiquita dealt with multiple changes in leadership during the investigation and scandal. The longtime CEO, Carl Linder, who was at the helm during most of the time the payments were going on, and surely knew the history, had left before the scandal really broke due to the company's bankruptcy. He was also the CEO of the Cincinnati Reds and was involved in many other Ohio-based companies. He jumped around but eventually retired in 2005. The volatility at the helm continued after him. The next CEO, Friedheim, only lasted 2 years. He jumped ship as well before the scandal got too bad. He was brought in to turn the company around, but given his other pursuits after Chiquita at companies like the Sun-Times and Sears, he obviously wasn't the best at it. Even though the scandal predated his arrival, he did not do much to avoid it and didn't stick around to fix it. Similarly, Chiquita's general counsel, Robert Olson, and head of their audit committee, Roderick Hills, who had worked with the Attorney General's office from the beginning and obviously knew what was going on, left the company rather than face up to the responsibility of their decision. Olson retired, although he returned to private practice in 2008, where he still works. Hills already had his own company, Hills Enterprises, which he continued to work at until his death in 2014. Neither were prosecuted individually. Another key player, Eric Holder Jr., served as Chiquita's defense attorney through 2009 and helped broker the plea agreement. However, he then served as U.S. Attorney General from 2009 to 2015. This crossing across the aisle is very common for the large companies, and once again leads to a lot of political inbreeding. As was alluded to with the discussion of major players, there was a lot of musical chairs going on during and after the investigation, both at Chiquita and at the Justice Department. This meant that players often had incomplete information. As the situational circumstances kept changing, it was easy to point the blame to the person who had gone out the door last. The company was the one being held responsible for the payments to terrorists, but in the end no one who had actually made the decision still worked at the company, nor were they held accountable. All that could be pointed to were the company's policies that allowed this to go on, and that was just the framework for the new players would have to address. At the Justice Department, the change in players on both sides, but especially internally, caused extensive delays in the investigation. This led to some facts being so old or poorly documented that when they were finally brought to trial or into evidence, Chiquita was able to claim ignorance or claim that previous prosecutors had acted differently. This led to even more delays. These legal delays in general, and especially when dealing with large corporations like Chiquita, reduce the gravity of the crime in the public's eyes. Things get watered down over time, and it's tough to see the ramifications, making other companies less likely to learn from the punishment. Even the company affected, like Chiquita, tends to avoid the full penalties, and thus the seriousness of the crime is lessened. By not having a constant lead at the helm, the investigation lost a lot of its momentum, and the ethical considerations were lost in the muck of bureaucracy.